So I wanted to thank you for providing that. But I know that you have a background in the arts, and I think we have scheduled to interview you at one point.
Yes.
How are you following your dream? I see that you're helping people edit their screenplays, and can you tell me just a little tiny bit about your work as well? Because I just know you as my son Pat's friend Corinne, who does podcasts and creates movies and is willing to act in some of Pat's movies and that sort of thing. So that whole screenwriting group that I know you and Pat are both a part of is how I know you as, someone who's creative and truly pursuing something in the arts all on her own.
So I have a program called 90 Day Screenplay. So the goal is to it's very simple, help people get their screenplays done in 90 days or less. But in terms of the actual looking over people's screenplays, it's well, at least for the time being, it has to be in like very small groups, because I get very emotionally invested in people's stories. And so there are two things that occurs. There is like, okay, what does the author intend to, like, how do they intend to end the story? Like, do they intend for the protagonist to achieve what they set, to achieve the goal that they set out for? Mm-hmm. There's that. And then I also have to think of, okay, what do I personally, like as the audience, what do I personally want out of this story? And so I have to keep a balance, because I'll be personally, like, I'll get very, very invested in like a character, and I'll internally I'll be rooting for them, and then the story goes left and I'll be like, but why did the writer have them do that? And I'll get emotional about it. Yeah. So I have to keep in mind that, okay, this is not my story, this is the writer's story. And so I have to keep in mind, okay, when you're with your friends, it's okay to get a little, I don't want to say the word emotional, but like you can be a bit more animated about your feelings. But when when it's like with total strangers, it's like, okay, I have to reel it in a bit.
Yeah. Well, Corinne, that is such a good example of the whole workplace dynamic, right? At what point do we switch from we're friends and we can go anywhere to, oh, wait, we are co-professionals working for the same organization, and in that way somewhat less invested in one another. So yeah, I love the way you described that. Where did you learn to write screenplays?
So I started writing, I think, back in like the 7th grade. Like I started like writing my own personal stories. I'll get more into it in my episode, but I started with that. But then when I got into university, I was here in Massachusetts for I think like a year, and I took some classes at Emerson University, mm-hmm. and so I took a screenwriting course and a video production course in the same semester. That was a stressful few months, but so for the screenwriting course, so there was screenwriting 1 and screenwriting 2. So I took screenwriting 1 in the fall and screenwriting 2 in the winter. So I ended up writing my first feature film, and that was back in 2014, like when I started, and jumped to like 2020. I went back and I reread it, and I'm like, oh my goodness, that like there, because like between 2014 and 2020 I was doing a lot of writing, and I'm like, wow, there is a whole lot I would change in this story, which I do plan to go back and fix that story. It's called The Tower, and the tower, it's in the story. The tower is in the story, but it's not as like, it's a place that the characters go to and they show up at, but it's not as important as the title would suggest. So it does need a bit of a rewrite, and maybe a title change, but for the time being, it's still called The Tower.
Right. So you need to take yourself to your own class.
Yes. So one of the things, so over the years, well, so like when I was in that class, one of the things I noticed was, okay, so you have the professor, they have, they're going through other like students, works as well, and we would bring our like hard copy, like not just a hard copy of our scripts, not just for us or for the professor, but for like everyone in the class. So I think there was like maybe 8 students when I was taking that class, including myself. So that's 8 copies, and keep in mind this is a feature film, so like by the end of the semester that was at least 90 pages. Any quantity, it could be like, it could have been 10 pages. It could have been a 10-page screenplay, and I have to make 8 copies of that. That's 80 pages right there. So that's a lot of like printing that you have to that you had to do. So that was,
and there's an expense right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but one thing I noticed was, I started to notice it in the screenplay course, but I also noticed it just in my everyday life. Also going back to my time, you know, when I would get feedback from from like, you know, like my for essays or creative writing or just like maybe like tests, like the teacher would have a comment or two, but they you know, they might say, oh, this part here didn't make much sense. It's like, okay, cool. But there wasn't a lot of recommendation, like, oh, you know, I would have liked to have seen X, or you know, this was a problem. I would recommend doing Y. So I and even when I give my projects to review from my friends, like I'll get a lot of, oh yeah, Corinne, that's really nice, that was really cool, or nah, Corinne, I wasn't really feeling it. And I'm like, okay, cool, but can you give me a recommend? Like I'm literally saying, hey, I'm giving you permission to tell me what you think or give recommendations, and you're not really giving me what I need. When I started to notice that, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to be more involved. And that's also partially because when I wasn't a huge fan reading growing up, but when but for the few stories I did have that was required reading in school, I was, you know, I remember there was one time where I was like, I would love to like know who the author was, so I could tell them personally how I felt about the story.
Oh, wow, you do make personal connections.
So that you know, so it's like, hey, this, you know, like I was like, you know, I was personally like affected by this part in the story. Why did you write it like that? Like, you know, like I really wanted to ask the creator of the work, you know, why they decided to make that decision. So because and you know, when you don't know the author, it's like it doesn't make much sense. Like, sure, I could have written them a letter, but but it's not the same as when you personally know the creator personally. So when I met Patrick, and when he started letting me read some of his scripts, that was a bit of an outlet for me to start to be a bit more animated with how I felt about people's
very nice.
Stories.
And Patrick is my son.
Yes,
that's how I know Corinne. I think I mentioned that before. But see, this conversation that you and I are having, we're knowing each other, things about each other that we hadn't known before. I mean, I knew you did the screenplays, but I didn't realize that deeper connection that you're seeking to the author and what's behind it. And you gave a classic work example as well, which is, right, we come to the boss and say, okay, here's 6 problems that exist. Like, good for you, you found the problems. Now, what are you going to do about it? You know, that place where we offer suggestions, where it's hard to give feedback or hard to talk about. It's easier when we know one another, like we've been doing throughout this process. So I want to thank you for everything you've done to help us do this, helping humans get to know each other. And I'm looking forward to when Tanya and I interview you. We've got notes. I hope Tanya's been taking some notes as she's listening, because there's more things we want to know.
Hi, I hope you liked that excerpt from the Great Brook podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss a new upload.